Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program focuses on NATO and imperialism, a very current topic given the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the demand that NATO cease its eastward expansion that has been threatening Russia. We're fortunate today to have with us as our speaker Margaret Flowers, an activist who has been active on a number of issues and is well known for her work with popularresistance.org. She also hosts a weekly radio program, Clearing the Fog. We're fortunate to have with us today also Harry, retired professor of political science at Purdue University. And so, with that as introduction, let's ask Margaret to give her presentation, followed then by discussion with Harry.
Thank you so much, Cliff, for inviting me to be with you today. And I'm really sorry that I can't be with everyone in person during the webinar. The time changes messed that up and other commitments that I have. So I have seen Harry's presentation. I've not heard it. And I apologize for that. But as Cliff said, I've been posting regularly about the situation on popularresistance.org. I've done a number of podcasts on this as well on my program, Clearing the Fog, which is available at Popular Resistance. And in terms of my involvement in the peace movement, I am on the administrative committee of the United National Anti-War Coalition, and I'm a member of the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council, which is a member of the World Peace Council. So, we've been doing a lot of work on this issue for a number of years now. And, I think it's important to look beyond just the situation in Ukraine to the bigger picture of, what are the roots of the current crisis that is being experienced in Ukraine. And that is this, U.S. struggle to hold on to global power. The world is changing and the United States is refusing to recognize that and is, and knows it. I mean, there's a Pentagon report from a number of years ago called a post-primacy report that recognizes the US is losing power, but instead of saying, well, gosh, maybe we should focus more on building relationships with the major powers, we have changed our national security strategy to be a great power conflict. And the recommendations in that report were more military spending, more surveillance, more aggression. So that's what we're seeing. And really the United States foreign policy is failing in many ways. Our military aggression is creating global insecurity. Our use of economic coercive measures, which are called sanctions, is driving isolation of the United States and de-dollarization, and just our unreliability as a partner. More and more countries are recognizing that you can't trust what the United States does. And so this is causing new relationships to be built outside of the United States. So in many ways, we're experiencing the last stages of capitalism, and the current conflict in Ukraine is part of that. I think it's important to recognize that NATO was largely created to fight socialism in the world, the rise of socialism, and became outdated, with the fall of the Soviet Union. So we're really kind of at this crossroads where the United States can become a global partner in good faith with other countries, or we can kind of go down fighting, which will result in devastation like we're seeing in Ukraine, loss of life, destruction of the planet, now risking nuclear war. So it's a very concerning time. And right now the US seems to be choosing that latter path of destruction. And I have to point out that many countries in the global South have a really different view of what's happening right now. They don't share the same sentiments of the US, but as targets of US imperialism, are really looking at the bigger picture of what's happening and are denouncing NATO and denouncing the economic coercive measures that the United States is using. So in general, overall, what's happening right now is that the population of the United States is being lied into another war, which could become a major conflict, could become a nuclear conflict. And part of this, there's a lot of different facets of this conflict, but part of it is over oil and gas. So, not wanting Russia to provide oil and gas to the European Union so that the United States, which is, one of the largest producers of oil and gas in the world, can sell its products to the European Union. And this is, there's a whole lot of implications of that. But with the recent report by the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, saying that we're really behind the ball in addressing the climate crisis and in adapting to it, this is just so detrimental in many ways. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of, for people who are from the United States or living in the United States, what should our response be to the conflict in Ukraine right now and to NATO? And there's three kind of basic points that I want to make. One is we must stand for upholding human rights and upholding the self-determination and sovereignty of other countries. Secondly, we really need to question the information that we're being told right now. The whole misinformation machine is going at top speed right now. And anything that you hear about the conflict in Ukraine, you really need to be questioning and looking at multiple sources. It's hard to get really good information of what's happening, but there are a lot of false narratives being pushed out there, and we need to question everything that we read in the corporate media. And then third, our responsibility is to focus on what the United States is doing. It's the Russian people's responsibility to focus on what their government is doing. But we're being driven through this whole propaganda machine to see this as Russia evil, and for us to focus on Russia. And that's a distraction that's being used to keep us from looking at what the United States government is actually doing and what the US role is in this conflict. So first off, NATO has become a tool of Western imperialism. It's largely dominated by the United States, and the US is pushing to expand it, not just to surround Russia, but also to surround China and into the Latin America as well, with Colombia as the newest NATO ally in Latin America. So it's, NATO's gone way beyond its initial purpose for existing. The United States broke its multiple promises not to expand NATO eastward after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And now, we find NATO encircling Russia, and some of the NATO nations like Poland hosting nuclear weapons in them as well. So, this would present a legitimate concern to any country that would be experiencing this type of military alliance and weaponry, expanding on its border. And so the really sad piece of this is that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people are being used as basically a pawn in this conflict. And the US really doesn't care. For all of its hand-wringing about the lives of Ukrainian people, the United States really doesn't care about the lives of the Ukrainian people. Let me just go to my next page of notes. So, despite what we're being told, this is not about democracy. It's not about the sovereignty of the people of Ukraine. The sovereignty of Ukraine was lost in 2014 when the United States led a coup to overthrow their democratically elected government. And then the new government, the Zelensky government, really doesn't act without support from the United States, without permission from the United States. I think he tried initially to act independently, and that ended fairly quickly. And so what the United States has done in Ukraine, and yes, there were concerns, like every country. I haven't found a country that doesn't have some concerns or some corruption. But what the United States does over and over again is it takes legitimate unrest, legitimate concerns, and it uses them for its own purposes. And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine. And that was what happened during the coup. So the Ukraine is largely a puppet right now of the United States. For many of us, we didn't see this war as beginning on February 24th, 2022. This war began after that US coup in 2014 with the attack on the Russian-speaking ethnic Russian people of Ukraine, which is the largest minority in Ukraine and has been for a long time. In the eastern region, it's actually a majority of the Donbass region and Crimea. And there were attacks on people who spoke Russian. There were efforts to outlaw the speaking of Russian. There are 800,000 Russian, citizens living in the eastern region of Ukraine. And basically this coup empowered these far-right nationalist elements within the military and the government, these neo-Nazis, who have been attacking the people of the East since 2014, targeting civilians, targeting infrastructure, their energy, their water, their hospitals, their schools. And while many of us in the peace movement were aware of this, you certainly didn't see this being talked about in the corporate media. The 14,000 people, ethnic Russians, who have been killed since 2014. In response to the US coup and their disagreement or opposition to the coup government, the people of Crimea voted to separate from Ukraine. And people in the Donbass region, the Donetsk and Lugansk, they voted to create they didn't want to leave Ukraine, but they wanted to have autonomy. They wanted to be independent within Ukraine. So they created the People's Republic of Donetsk and of Lugansk. And they signed what's called the Minsk Accords with the Kiev government. And those accords called for them to be recognized as being independent, and also called for a ceasefire to stop the attacks on them and on their people. But the Kiev government has not respected the Minsk Accords and continued to violate that ceasefire agreement. And in fact, in February, began to escalate their violations of those ceasefires. And there was a monitoring group, the OSCE, an independent monitoring group that was present there that was documenting those ceasefire violations. When the Russian intervention happened, they left, and eventually I think all of them are out now. So we don't have that documentation that we had, but it was becoming so bad that on February 18th, they began mass evacuations of the Donbass region to get people out to safety. And I think we have to look at the fact that, I don't defend the Russian invasion. I don't agree with war anywhere. I don't think that violence is the answer, but I think we need to understand the context within which this is happening, and how the Russian government did offer a diplomatic path out of this current conflict. their demands were legitimate. Don't expand NATO. Ukraine should be a neutral nation, respect the independence of the Eastern Ukraine. And the United States refused, and in fact escalated not just the ceasefire violations, the Ukrainian army that's funded, trained, and armed by the US, but also then President Zelensky went to Munich and basically said, and now we would like to acquire nuclear weapons, something that Ukraine had in the past, gave up in the mid-1990s, and has the ability to host nuclear weapons right there on the border with Russia. So these were seen as red lines. Russia was telling everybody in the world that these were red lines, and the US just continued to poke and poke and poke. And so I think that there's a lot of responsibility for the current conflict that lies on the shoulders of the United States government. So this war that began in 2014 moved to a really dangerous phase with the Russian invasion in 2022. And now I think we're in this really strange place where there's division within the peace movement of the United States. There are people who are actually calling for a no-fly zone to be established over Ukraine, not recognizing the implications of that would require a defense of that no-fly zone and could bring direct conflict between NATO and Russian forces, which could greatly escalate this conflict. The rising risk of nuclear war, and the US has been modernizing its nuclear weapons. President Obama started that program to make them more usable. The US has dropped out of nuclear treaties. We haven't entered those treaties again yet, so that's of concern. And then the other piece of this is this rising Russophobia that's occurring, not just in the United States, but in other Western imperialist nations as well. We're seeing attacks in New York City and Washington, D.C. There were restaurants, Russian-owned restaurants, that people vandalized because of this. We're seeing, stores dropping Russian products, Russian artists being canceled, Russian athletes being banned from participating in competitions. And the hypocrisy of this. The United States invaded Iraq in 2003 in violation of international law, but did you see the sanctions and this kind of condemnation of the United States at that time? The same week that Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States was bombing Somalia, Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen, Israel bombing Gaza. What's happening in Afghanistan right now, with the United States basically stealing the central bank of Afghanistan's money, over $7 billion, that the US not only is refusing to return to that central bank, but is now taking on its own to pay out to victims of 9/11, something that the government of Afghanistan and the Afghanistan people had nothing to do with. And now more than half of the population of Afghanistan is facing severe food insecurity as a result. But these are Black and brown nations. We're not hearing the same level of outcry and condemnation of what's happening there. So this just shows this manipulation, this amazing manipulation of people in the United States. And who does this Russophobia, who does it serve? It serves the military industrial complex. It serves the global elites. It's being used to justify this violence in Ukraine. It's being used to justify this economic war. And there are good arguments that this economic war is not just going to hurt the Russian people, who the Russian people have nothing to do with this war, just like, we in the United States, many of us disagree with what our country is doing. But those economic measures are going to hurt the European Union economy. It's going to hurt the US economy as well. It's going to drive more inflation. It's going to prevent the economic recovery that we need. It's unifying NATO, which had been beginning to divide, and unifying, more support for NATO. And it's being used to justify more military spending. So last week on Friday, Congress passed the new government spending bill, which contains $782 billion for the Pentagon. This is $29 billion more than what the Pentagon asked for. It's $42 billion more than what they received last year. And in that spending, 13 billion is going to Ukraine, but the Democrats dropped 15 billion from the bill in COVID relief. They cut all the COVID relief programs because they ostensibly were fighting with the Republicans on how to fund that, including our global COVID relief, which means that the Biden administration's promise of providing vaccines around the world is not going to happen. It's not happening at the pace that it needs to, and now they're not going to have the funding to continue to do that. So, this is great for the military-industrial complex, but it's hurting the people in the United States, here at home. So, some people are saying that part of the reason for this escalation is that Biden was losing popularity. His response to the COVID pandemic, the inflation that's happening, was causing him to lose popularity. And it is amazing how people in the US are unifying around this and suddenly are seeing themselves as, oh, we're paying more at the gas station because we're really sucking it to the Russians, as if the ban on the small amount of Russian oil imports is going to drive the prices that it is. Those two are not related, but that's what the media is telling people. So what do we do? I think context does matter. We need to educate people about the context of this conflict, fight the misinformation that's happening out there. We need to demand that the US stop its intervention in Ukraine. We've spent also tens of millions through the National Endowment of Democracy to interfere in the politics and the media in Ukraine. We need to stop sending weapons to Ukraine, stop training the military. We need to oppose the NATO expansion. There's a growing movement against NATO, and we need to adamantly oppose a no-fly zone. The Biden administration right now is opposing it, but we can't count on that lasting. We need to oppose these illegal economic coercive measures or sanctions. We need to oppose Russophobia. The Russian people are not our enemy. We need to demand that international law be upheld by all nations, not just the United States, but by all nations. But certainly we can't exclude the United States from that. And we need to continue to build this global peace movement, focused on the abolition of war as a tool and the use of diplomacy and international law as a way to resolve our conflicts going forward. And I think the multiple crises that we're facing right now through the pandemic, the economic crisis, the climate crisis, demand that we escalate our efforts to build this global movement to make the changes that we need to make. So I may have gone over 20 minutes and I apologize, and I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Margaret. Now let me ask Harry Targ if he wants to make any comments.
Okay, I'll make six. I think refer to 6 points. As I suspected, for 99% of what Margaret presented, I agree with. And if you expected a debate, you're not going to find it. I will be talking later, I gather, about the history of NATO. So I won't say too much more about that, but that's an interesting historical story. Secondly, and several of these are more or less to elaborate and underscore Margaret's points, I've been very concerned and uncomfortable about debate on the left or among progressives in reference to Ukraine. And there are a number of people who have challenged those of us who see historical context as terribly important as being apologists for the Russian invasion. And I think we have to figure out a way to get over that. I think that's very destructive. And at this critical juncture with an upcoming congressional election, to have splits on the left, even more splits on the left, is very unfortunate and disadvantageous to us, and I think a majority of the people of the United States. Third, I think this war, in a sense, at the extraordinary expense and pain of the Ukrainian people and Russian soldiers, is a potential teachable moment because of all the points that Margaret raised. Someone used a reference of tectonic shifts in the nature of the international system, implying a metaphor in which basically the ground at which we walk on is shifting dramatically. And I think that's really true. I think the power of the United States as a former hegemon is declining significantly. I think citizens of the global South are more skeptical and less interested in the war in Ukraine than those of us from North America and Europe are. And it seems crystal clear that if we're to get out of this immediate morass, China will have to play a significant role. And this raises another point. It seems to me that that might be going on right now. I used to teach US foreign policy, and I used to spend at least one period on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at that point in time, people began to talk about the concept of back channels. That is to say, diplomatic negotiation going on below the surface and almost in contradiction to publicly articulated ideological rhetoric. If one looks at the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, an ABC journalist, I think his name was John Scali, was meeting informally with Russian journalists, and both were communicating back to their countries possible gives and takes, that is to say, compromises that would end the crisis. I'm hoping that such back channels are emerging right now. And there were some newspaper accounts today to suggest that they might be. On a more public level, if one looks at statements by the president of Ukraine, he sent out signals that were designed to mollify Russian concerns, and they were ignored. And as Margaret suggested, the Ukrainians were pressured not to engage in any compromise with Russia. Among the back channel issues that should be discussed, the relative autonomy or independence of the Donbass region, promises by Ukraine and the Nato countries that Ukraine would not be considered for admission into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the third, a recognition of the semi-autonomy of the Donbass region. And these, it seems to me, are negotiable positions that would appeal to some of the concerns that the Russians have. And so we should disabuse ourselves of the horrific rhetoric that is generated by the media and our politicians, and give support as a peace movement to efforts to bring an end to this immediate crisis. One last general point I want to raise, and again, Margaret has dealt with that, is what I chose to call the Vijay Prashad problem. Vijay made a presentation, I think, at COP26 meeting last summer that I saw on YouTube, and it was titled "War is a Crime." And I have a link to it in my PowerPoint, but I don't know if we'll have time to look at. And Vijay points out that when you look at the problem of war and violence in the world, you have to disaggregate conceptions of violence. Some of it involves what peace researchers call direct violence, killing, war traditionally as we know it, violence as we know it, and two, structural violence. That is to say, institutions and structures that create systems of domination and subordination, wealth, power on one hand, and victimhood on the other hand, what we would call colonial or neo-colonial situations. And therefore, Vijay has been an articulate advocate of reconceptualizing world history as in part a struggle between the global North and the global South. And I think he makes a powerful case that the violence that we see going on in Europe, the violence that generates so much passion in the United States and in Western Europe, ignores the day-to-day violence that 2 to 3 billion people experience, a kind of quiet violence, a structural violence, a violence of hunger and poverty and powerlessness. And somehow we need to address those kinds of concerns when we think about the problems of war and peace, and show the fundamental and inextricable connections between direct violence, the problem of war that we're now worried about in Ukraine, and the problem of structural violence, grotesque economic and political inequalities in the world. So this is all that I have to say, and I think it fits entirely with Margaret's excellent presentation.
Okay, well, let's open the floor now to others here in the Zoom room. If you have comments or questions that you want to raise.
There's
Okay,
Jerry.
I see Jerry.
Great. Well, there's a lot that I agree with in the presentations and some that I disagree with. First, I agree that we have to expose NATO expansion, US imperialism, certainly. That particularly we should point out the hypocrisy around Iraq and what's being talked about today in terms of Ukraine. I think it's a good opportunity to really talk more about sustainable economies and the move away from fossil fuels. And it's a good time to talk about all refugees and all immigrants, not just white immigrants from the Ukraine. But I think we also have to talk more about Russia and the reactionary nature of Russia, great power chauvinism and Russian imperialism, not just the US. Our main responsibility, I believe, is to independence and self-determination. That's our main responsibility, upholding those principles. I know many of us, I could see just from the age of most of us here on the Zoom, is that we all remember the Vietnam War, and we all remember the main slogan of the Vietnamese people and Ho Chi Minh: nothing is more precious than independence and self-determination. That's true when we talk about Cuba, it's true when we talk about Venezuela, and it's true when we talk about the Ukraine. And we can't just say we're for peace and then spend 95% of our time talking about NATO. We have to be more consistent in our principles and loud about our principles about independence, self-determination. A couple other points. One about this idea that the war is about oil. This ignores the actual character of global capitalism and transnational capitalism. The fact is, Exxon, Shell, BP all have major holdings and have had major holdings in fossil fuel industry in Russia for many, many years, and have been making profits off of Russian oil and gas, just as the Russian state and Russian private capital make money off of those investments. So it's hard to say that it's about oil when the export of Russian oil to the EU benefits Exxon, it's BP, and benefits Shell, benefits Total, and just about every major oil major in the world today. And I find it, another point, I find this rather curious, this talk about Russia's legitimate security concerns, as if the Ukraine has no legitimate security concerns, as if Estonia and Lithuania and Poland have no legitimate security concerns, If we talk about historic context, we should absolutely talk about NATO's push eastward, but we should also talk about the contents of great Russian chauvinism and what Russian imperialism has done in Eastern Europe. There's a reason why countries in Eastern Europe want to disassociate themselves with Russia and have moved closer to the West. Their leaders are neoliberal globalists. They're not, that's obvious. But when you say, well, you know, Ukraine has asked for nukes and we can't accept nukes on the border of Russia. Well, Russia has nukes on the border of Ukraine, right? Why don't we look at that too? I'm not for Ukraine joining NATO, but there's agency in Ukraine. And this idea that Ukraine is simply a puppet and a pawn of US imperialism is typical of a Western-centric view of the world that pervades the Western left. People in Ukraine have agency. People in Eastern Europe have agency, their own agency and their own political will. And there's been a civil war going on in Ukraine that must be resolved among Ukrainians without outside interference. You know, we really, just on Russia a little more, if we may, Russia is a far right nationalist nation, you know, nation state. It is Putin is an icon and a hero of the neo-fascist movement in the US. He's a hero of the neo-fascist movement throughout Europe. His social base is much in the Eastern Ukrainian Orthodox Church, just like Trump's evangelical base is here. He's surrounded by a corrupt oligarchy. And part of the forces that have gone into Donetsk from Russia are people, Cossacks and other forces who want to reestablish the Tsarist empire. You know, Putin has attacked Lenin and the Bolsheviks for having, for their policy of regional autonomy and a federated Russia. I mean, this guy wants to return to the Tsarist empire. So there's agency on the Russian side, not just reacting to NATO, but they have their own designs and their own sphere of influence and their own global power project that they're following. It's just not all NATO. There's a two to tango here. So it's a dance between two imperialisms, not just one imperialism. So I'll cut it there. There's more to say, and I'm sure we will, because we'll be debating this, but I'll leave it there.
Cliff, do you want us to respond to the comments or?
Yeah, yes, if you would.
And I'm sure Harry has some comments as well, but I have to head out pretty soon to pick up my children. So yeah, I did say that it was in part about oil, not all about oil. And you know, we know that the US has been opposed to the Nord Stream pipeline, you know, for a long time. And that's part of the picture as well. You know, yes, every country has legitimate security concerns, but to compare the imperialism of the United States with Russia is, you know, they're very different. We're looking at a very strong empire versus a weaker empire. I haven't seen. It wasn't Russia that established AFRICOM and you know, started setting up bases all over Africa. It wasn't you know, Russia that has been supporting the Saudis in their attack on Yemen, or that is, you know, backing the Israelis in their occupation and violence against the Palestinians, or that is, you know, engage in all the other aggression, you know, that the United States is currently engaged in. So yeah, it's always going to be a power between, you know, these struggles for power in the world. But I think that what the U.S. is doing is very aggressive and is very counterproductive, and is really driving more and more countries to establish relationships with Russia and with China. I find it really interesting that the U.S. is, now turning to Venezuela, which has the largest oil reserves in the world, and saying, oh, can you just forget that little coup thing that we did and all these sanctions, and we'd like to develop a new agreement with you about oil. But Venezuela isn't that stupid. The United States has been, is responsible through its economic war for the deaths of at least 100,000 Venezuelans over the last few years, has been arming insurgents on the border with Colombia who've been going in and attacking, who attempted the assassination of President Maduro. And so, it's really, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And I don't think that, that our concern should be with it's not our responsibility or right to, how should I put this, to criticize the politics of the Russian government. That's for the Russian people to determine. Our role is to focus on our government. The United States has allyship with all kinds of far-right governments, and in fact has been responsible for installing far-right governments. If you look at Colombia, Honduras, Brazil, and other places around the world, it's not like the U.S. has any concern, about that. So I think that it's so kind of part of our ingrained American exceptionalism to believe that we have some sort of a responsibility to determine what types of governments other countries have, and maybe use that. I don't think you were trying to use that as a justification for the conflict. I hope you weren't trying to use that as a justification. But I also think that it's really important. There's been this real drive to make this about Putin, as if President Putin is Russia. And this is a tactic that's used to be able to, you demonize one person and then you can make a whole population believe that it's just fine to attack that country. And I think we have to recognize that. I'll stop there and see what Harry has to say.
Well,
I get-
Margaret needs to leave shortly, and so let me just ask if there's any quick statement that anyone wants to make while we still have her with us. Okay, Peggy Rivard-Soul.
Thanks, Cliff. Margaret, since you're going to leave, I just have a quick question. Well, maybe it's not even quick. What if the United States foreign policy in this interaction with Ukraine and Russia and NATO, what if the policy was to ask the Ukraine to not insist on NATO participation? From your perspective, would that have made, or would that make a difference? Because that goes to the agency that Gary's talking about.
Well, I think President Zelensky has indicated, from reports I've seen recently, an openness to discussions around the issue of NATO membership. And I think I also saw reports saying that NATO didn't actually intend for Ukraine to eventually be a full member. But I think that in terms of, I think that it's not up to the United States to determine what the resolution of this is. I think what we need to do is step back and let President Zelensky, they're doing peace negotiations. I understand they're talking again today. I think this is the fourth round of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. I think that we need to leave it up to them to determine what kinds of compromises they can make to end this. But it's really clear that the U.S. is not, the U.S. is really escalating its use of NATO as a tool for our own foreign policy. And I think it's concerning the way that it's infiltrating, other parts of the world. And it's not a defensive force. We know that, it's become an offensive force. And so I think our position has to be to either stop the expansion or end NATO altogether, and to stop our interference in Ukraine. Let them work it out.
Thank you.
Hey, Cliff, is there
And Bob-
time?
Bob-
Is there time for me to throw in a few?
Yeah, real quick.
Okay, this is, I hate to disagree with my friend Jerry, but 3 quick points. One, the question we have today is how to get out of this war. And that means a contextual analysis. That means addressing the concerns, whether justified or not, on the Russian side as well as the Ukrainian side. Two, as Margaret has pointed out, we have this tendency to personify Russia such that it's all about Putin. And as someone who studies international relations, I think that's a colossal reductionism. And three, I would love to see the kind of political economy structural analysis of Russia that most of us are able to provide about the United States. Hardly ever see it in the media. The one article that I saw that talked about Putin, the oligarchs in his immediate circle, his security advisors and others, was in Financial Times. And while I was a little uncomfortable with some of the analysis, I think this is a kind of analysis we need to do instead of making general claims about Putin, neo-fascism, and the connection between Russia and the United States. I'd like to see a rich, detailed analysis of the structure of the Russian state and political economy. And of course, the mainstream media is not likely to provide that. So these are some of my concerns about Jerry's comments.
Well, in closing then, let me give our thanks to Margaret Flowers for an informative discussion. And thanks also to Harry Targ and others who contributed to today's discussion. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. I hope you will join us again for our next webinar on women's cooperatives as a site of empowerment and resistance with philosopher Margaret McLaren. And so now, for now, thanks to our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestres, Gregory Diamond, Olivia Canales, and myself, Cliff Duran. And now, signing off until next Monday.